Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cinema Mancuso, and this is Notes on the News. I'm Peter Mancuso, and this is the show where I break down the biggest stories in film, media, and entertainment and give you my thoughts. If you joined us live, super happy to have you. If at any point during the show you have any questions or comments about any of the topics I'm going to be covering, feel free to drop it in the live chat. Going to try to do my best here. Got my phone up, keep an eye on it. See if we can maybe get a conversation started. And if you haven't already, please like the live stream. It really does help with other people finding the channel and this weekly show. So please do that if you haven't already. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. We just recently crossed the 200 subscriber threshold. Woohoo! So if you haven't already, please do that. If you're watching this after the fact, still super happy to have you. By the time you're watching this, there should be time codes in the description for each of the topics for you to jump around at your leisure. We stream this show every Monday night, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And again, same deal as before. Please like this video if you haven't already, and subscribe. Hold on. Okay, let me just grab a quick drink here. Okay. So let's take a look at the box office from this past weekend. A total box office was just shy of 88 million domestically, which constituted about a 37% drop. Which, is not great to see. But again, August, like I've been talking about, August is like that slower period. So it kind of makes sense because we're not really getting many big movies being released. So a lot of this box office is holdovers from the bigger films from the summer, right? In terms of stuff opening this weekend, we had the Zoe Kravitz written and directed thriller, if you will, called Blink Twice. Opened to about 7.3 million, which fell right in the middle of my projections of between 5 and 9. So, it was able to cross that kind of threshold there. But had, it's still not necessarily great to see. I haven't heard great reviews for it. I've recently just, been recovering from COVID. So I haven't been able to go see a lot of stuff lately. From my understanding, the reviews have been fine. Not bad, but not necessarily super stellar. So this is a little concerning if you're Zoe Kravitz, because if you look here at the right side of this chart, so far its total worldwide box office is only around 14 million. But it was made for about 20, which itself was already cheap, right? So it's not like it had this bloated budget. Like we'll see with another film that opened this weekend. But as you can see, right now it's a negative % return, right? So if it could have the legs and the momentum to, kind of be like a consistent performer every weekend, that would be fine. But again, the word of mouth has not been particularly great, so I'd be surprised if this ends up, being a box office juggernaut, if you will. Also opening this weekend was The Forge, which I believe was like a Christian film. I'm gonna double check this. I believe it was distributed by Affirm Films, which is like that, kind of family, a Christian film studio, right? The premise of this is, after graduating from high school without any plans for the future, Isaiah receives a push to start making better life decisions. Interesting. Okay. So, this did not open super big, obviously, only brought in about 6.6 million. That's also its worldwide total, but it was only made for 5 million. So it's already kind of crossed that initial threshold. Now, if it can get to 10, I would consider a success. But again, unless this has like a big overseas market that's about to open up, I think this one is also going to be a dud. But talk about more than a dud. We got another big bomb. August always seems to have one big, well, I say one, but we've already had Borderlands, but it looks like August is giving us 2 big bombs. So opening at number 8 is The Crow remake with one of the Skarsgård children, only bringing in about 4.6 million, even falling short of its very low projections of 6 to 10, right? And that is both its domestic and worldwide total so far, off of a $50 million budget, right? So that is not good, right? Right now it's a negative 90%. I don't think there's ever been a movie that opened at a negative 90% return and was able to become profitable later, short of like re-releases over years and decades. So that's, if you're the filmmakers of The Crow, that's a little disappointing to see, but also I feel like I've seen nothing from this movie, but also a bunch. Like recently, feels like it was like a recent blitz on like Hulu. Like every other ad was for The Crow. But but it was like this like past week or 2 weeks, right? So, you know, and on top of it, not really getting very good reviews at all. You know, with Blink Twice, we said they weren't great reviews, but this was like actively negative reviews. So, this is, I'm going to officially label this a box office bomb. Continuing into the second weekend, we have Alien Romulus, bringing in, dropping from first to second, now in its second frame. Bringing in just a little more than 16 million for the weekend. But it was a pretty big drop. It was about 61% drop, which is sure, I wouldn't say it's catastrophic, but it's one level below, right? Especially in its second weekend. That must mean, and which is surprising because it's gotten some pretty decent reviews, it seems. So I'm not sure what's going on there, probably because I was supposed to go see it. But then I had COVID, so I had to cancel. That's probably their answer, right? It actually even added a couple theaters, too, it looks like. So, you know, I don't know what's going on with this movie. But despite that, it's still so far going to be at least moderate success, right? So it's brought in about 73-ish million domestically and 225 million worldwide. So that's a big jump. If you look at last weekend, it had about 108 million worldwide, so it more than doubled its worldwide budget in a week. So it must have either been doing really well overseas or maybe some new overseas markets opened up. But again, this was just off of an $80 million budget. So as you see over there, my percent return column, it's in the green. So at this point, I would say it's a moderate success. Now, despite having such a big drop, it's still in the top 5. I mean, it's top 2. It's number 2. So if it can keep kind of that momentum going, it could become even more than just a moderate success, right? Also continuing this weekend, we have the Coraline re-release. It was this is like at this point, when did that come out? I think like 2009, 2010. It's dropped from 5th to 7th in its second frame, bringing just a little more than 5 million for the weekend. About a just under 50% drop. But again, and this was kind of my point last week, but, you know, I know a lot of you aren't necessarily watching week to week, so I'll reiterate it, that, you know, the fact that a 15-ish year old movie is being re-released and is making it 2 weeks in a row in the top 10 speaks to kind of the state, not necessarily the state of the box office, but more so the state of audience appetite. That if you put these movies that people love back in theaters, they will show up, even if it's available to them, right? You're not going to be able to make huge money, and that's why the whole theatrical versus streaming debate that we had in COVID was really dumb, because you're never going to get normal people. You're never going to get enough people to just rent it or watch it on streaming to make up for the money you're going to lose by not doing it theatrically. But in this case, just to kind of have a little extra cash come in, this is $5 million that they didn't have before, and it made about 8 last week, so it's made about an extra 13 million. You know, and all parties involved, you know, it's still being able to bring in some money. So, looking at the film's total box office take, including, you know, its original releases and subsequent re-releases, this brings Coraline's domestic total to about 107 million, and its worldwide total to about 162 million, just off of a $60 million budget. So, you know, obviously this is not a new movie, but that's an extra $13 million that keeps adding to that percent return, which is close to about 170%. Let's see, what else? So in the top 5, we still have Deadpool and Wolverine. Interesting, it had held first place for 3 weekends, dropped to second, but because Alien Romulus, which opened first last week, because Alien Romulus had such a big drop, Deadpool is now number 1 again, right? So it brought in just a little more than 18 million, just a 39% drop. Again, 18 million is just a drop in the bucket of what it's made, but again, that's $18 million they didn't have. So it's this kind of, it's all about momentum. Hollywood has really transitioned into being super, super focused on the big openings, because that's good for headlines. And also, if your movie's not great, it's better to front load it so that as word of mouth spreads that's not very good, you're not going to get a lot of people. So you want to get as many people in on that first weekend. But really, that's not sustainable, right? So having a movie that could just keep performing and performing week after week is really valuable. And for a movie that's been in the top 10 for about 5 weekends now, it's a fairly old quote unquote film. It did have the highest per theater average at for about 4,700 per theater. Beating out all these newer movies. This brings its domestic total to about $577 million, and its worldwide total to 1.2-ish billion. So definitely a big success for Marvel. But again, the question will be, will they be able to sustain that into other non-Fox, Deadpool, Marvel movies, right? Also still in the top 5 here, we have, it ends with Us, the semi-controversial adaptation of the Colleen Hoover novel, which itself was semi-controversial, holding its third place spot in its third frame, bringing in just under 12 million, a 50% drop. So not great, but again, it is in its third weekend, you're going to see that. And even added about 100 theaters. So despite the controversy, again, this is hugely successful for everyone involved, right? Because if you look at the totals here, 121-ish million domestically, 243 million worldwide, off of just a $25 million budget, right? So we got, an 870% return. Maybe I think a lot of Hollywood executives are going to look at the success of this and go, we need to greenlight more movies based off of not just books, not just popular books, but semi-polarizing books. Because that can generate a lot of interest, right? And it ends up being free publicity if you're a cynical business executive, right? Just a couple other notes here. We have at 9 and 10, 2 films that really were big performers for the summer. We have Despicable Me 4 dropping from 6th to 9th in its 8th frame, bringing just 4.4 million, about a 30% drop. But this brings its worldwide total to $885 million off of a $100 million budget. So very good percent return, very good for Illumination, for the Minions, Despicable Me franchise, good for Universal, which of course is the parent company of all this. And then the big moneymaker, right? The big highest grossing movie of the year so far, Inside Out 2, dropping from 8th to 10th in its 11th frame. This movie's been out for almost 3 months now, and is still bringing in 7-figure return, 7 figures every weekend for domestic. It did have the lowest per theater average, despite having it's not really in many theaters at this point. It's only in about 1,500 theaters, but it's still considered wide. But again, at this point, it's just about every little extra sprinkle on the cake, right? Because this brings its domestic total to 646 million, and its worldwide total to 1.6 billion. Off of a $200 million budget. So this has definitely been the summer, for better or for worse, of, hey, Hollywood, just make sequels of movies that people already like, and they will make a shit ton of money. I think where Marvel got into trouble was assuming that being part of this shared universe was enough. And I think audiences, they want to see the continuation of Inside Out. They want to see Deadpool's next chapter. Whereas no one really cares about the random MCU movie, because even though it's technically it's not quite a sequel, it's just another kind of installment in a larger universe that is obviously connected, but not necessarily always ping-ponging off of one another. So, again, I think that is potentially damaging, right? Because, again, it incentivizes Hollywood to just be really conservative. I don't mean politically, but just in terms of, being very safe in terms of the movies that it decides to make. But in any case, I think that is the lesson if you're a Hollywood executive here. And also, we still have Twisters. We almost moved on. I wanted to mention Twisters here. Dropped from 4th to 6th, and it's 6th frame, though. So this has been out for about a month and a half. Brought in about 6.2 million for the weekend. It's so close to crossing that second threshold, right? You want to double your budget to account for the marketing costs. And right now it's at about 347 million worldwide off of a $175-ish million budget. 97% return. We want to get to 100. It's so close. And I think because it's not at the very bottom of the top 10, I think by next week we're going to see it finally, that little yellow square, the little yellow rectangle over on the right, it's going to turn green. Fingers crossed. Again, not a great movie, but a really fun movie. Perfect kind of popcorn, summery, blockbustery fun. Okay, let me grab a quick drink here. Okay. So let's talk about story number 1. So, The Acolyte, which is one of the latest Star Wars Disney Plus shows, has been canceled by Disney after just one season. This news comes about a month after the first, and now in retrospect only, season. About a month after this first season ended its 8-episode run. So it wasn't like a super, super long season. It's a pretty typical modern streaming season of really, really expensive episodes, but there's not a lot of them, as opposed to the old days where there would be like 20, 22 episodes a season, but they weren't necessarily super high budget, right? This comes as a semi-shock, in the sense that Deadline notes that showrunner Leslie Headland had already pitched ideas for a second season to Disney. And Variety notes that season 1, it ended with several cliffhangers that would have inevitably been answered or explored in further seasons, right? So let's do a little context here if you're not aware of like what's going on. So what is The Acolyte? So again, this is a Star Wars Disney Plus show. Here's the Wikipedia description of the premise, and it says, quote, "The Acolyte is set at the end of the Star Wars franchise's High Republic era, approximately 100 years before The Phantom Menace," so episode 1. It sees a respected Jedi Master investigating a series of crimes that bring him into contact with a former Padawan learner and reveals sinister forces, end quote. Which is a really intriguing idea, right? When it came out, however, the critical reception was solid, but not great, right? So it has about a 78% on Rotten Tomatoes, if you're from the UK. The critical consensus, it reads, quote, "Taking fresh risks with Star Wars lore while having infectious fun playing with the stylistic trappings of a galaxy far, far away, The Acolyte is a Padawan series with the potential to become a master," end quote. And unless something changes, that's not going to happen, right? So the critical reception was solid, but not overwhelmingly positive. And then on top of that, viewership was also not super strong. It started fairly strong, but it just couldn't sustain the momentum. So on its first day of release, I think it launched with the first 2 episodes on the same day, which a strategy that I think they did with Obi-Wan as well, the Obi-Wan show. It had about 4.8 million views in its first day of release, and after the first 5 days, it had about 11.1 million, which was the biggest series premiere of 2024, but still below Ahsoka, right? The Ahsoka show on Disney Plus. Nielsen, like the company that tracks television watch data and obviously has moved aggressively into streaming, since that's become like the dominant way people consume television. Nielsen estimated that the first 2 episodes were watched for 488 million minutes during the week of June 3rd, which is like when it launched, which brought it in 7th place for that week. So good, it made it into the top 10, but not great, right? And that was kind of a high point. It kind of steadily declined week to week, though it did get a bump for the season finale. Which had an estimated 355 million minutes viewed, so not that much lower than that first week. But it is believed, we don't have like concrete data about this, but it's believed to be the lowest for any Star Wars show's season finale, at least in the streaming era, right? So that's kind of a bunch of business things, right? That it, was received well, but not overwhelmingly well. And it had good viewership, but not great viewership. But the big thing that everyone's been talking about is how polarizing it is. And, maybe that's not fair. Maybe I should say, though, how much it polarized fans, whether it really deserved to be polarizing or not, right? So some fans welcomed, a big thing about the show, as you can see from this image here, it furthered the Disney Star Wars era's imperative to make the Star Wars universe more diverse, right? Diverse in terms of gender, in terms of race, very loosely in terms of sexuality, but really in terms of race and gender, right? So of course, as we've seen, this is polarizing. So again, a lot of fans welcomed the increased diversity, right? A lot of people there's a lot of, we think of nerds and nerd culture as being a very kind of like scrawny, nerdy, white, straight guys thing. But ultimately, nerd culture and Star Wars fandom specifically is so much more diverse than that. So there is an understandable excitement of seeing, someone that looks like you, seeing yourself represented in the media that you love most, right? So I think that really needs to be underlined here, right? Though I will say that sometimes those fans, not even those fans, but just people in general, will give content or media that is mediocre or even good, they'll give it a pass on a bunch of things in terms of quality because of those strides in representation, right? And ultimately, strides in representation in compelling television are not mutually exclusive, but they're not necessarily correlated. So something that is really innovative and revolutionary in terms of the representation it provides to marginalized communities does not a compelling television series make, right? So I would imagine that there's a lot of people that maybe are giving the Acolyte a semi-pass on certain elements in terms of how good certain cinematic elements are because they're just so enthused about that, right? But a lot of people, even beyond the diversity part, a lot of people just appreciated how the series challenged our ideas of the Jedi, right? Now, for there to be polarization, you have someone on one side, and then you have people on the other, and there was a huge backlash to this, as we've seen with Disney Star Wars since the reveal of a black stormtrooper as a main character, all the way back to that first Force Awakens trailer back like at the end of 2014, right? There's this certain segment of the Star Wars fandom that is very reactionary. Conservative is the wrong word because they're younger men. It's I don't want to use the word conservative, but this reactionary kind of, defensive posturing to, basically seeing these diversity efforts as, like going woke, right? And using that in a pejorative sense, right? So again, we've seen this for the past decade in terms of Star Wars. We've seen very blatant racism, sexism, and then also even if their attacks have nothing to do with identity politics, they will go after creators, even if they're just like straight white men, if they feel that they are tampering with what they feel Star Wars quote unquote is, right? They have like a dogmatic adherence to what Star Wars quote unquote is. And again, there is, how do I put this? There is justifiable, explainable, and defendable critiques you can have about a movie or TV show on a bunch of different artistic and formal elements. But if one of your issues is just that, oh, there's black people now in Star Wars, or there's more than you would want to see, right? Because we've always had black people in Star Wars, but it's always been like the one character, right? And, once your critique moves into that sphere, you kind of, what's the phrase? You kind of like undermine your point, or you kind of disqualify you from being taken seriously, frankly. So, like a lot of Star Wars properties and other just things in Hollywood of franchises that have quote-unquote gone woke, the show is review bombed on Rotten Tomatoes, right? So if you don't know what that is, review bombing is when you go on something like, it's usually on Rotten Tomatoes, but it really could be on any site that has people, like users rate, video games or movies or shows. And people go in droves, almost like they're like an army mobilizing, and leave bad scores so that the score tanks. The user score tanks, right? Again, it's often used by reactionary conservatives to protest inclusionary content. And it worked because right now on Rotten Tomatoes, the Acolyte currently has an 18% audience score, right? Like we said, the critical score from the kind of the aggregate analysis of reviewers that gave it positive reviews is like 78%. So that's a big difference that you can't just explain by, the critics are out of touch. This is very clear, like this is the playbook that people have been using for a decade. This is a concerted effort to damage the brand of something that they see is is going too far, right? So on top of, complaining online and review bombing it, you have people now going after the cast and crew, right? So, the Hollywood Reporter notes that Headland, the showrunner, the director of, Sleeping with Other People with Alison Brie and Jason Sudeikis, which I thought was actually quite a good film. She's a lesbian, right? So, of course, people are going to go after her for that, even though it has nothing to do with this, really. And then Amanda Stenberg, who is pictured here, she's like one of the stars of the show, talked about kind of the hate that she's received, even leading up to it. Like, the show hadn't even come out yet. Just the trailer had come out. She had spoken on The View, kind of detailing her experience, and I have a quote here saying, quote, "It's been very painful to me. It's not something that I think you can emotionally prepare for. We welcome criticism of the show when it comes to storytelling or performance, but when it comes to death threats, horrific, violent, racist language, it's unacceptable to me," end quote. And I have to agree with her, right? Again, you can have legitimate creative critiques, but when it veers into any kind of bigotry, that's already, again, you've already disqualified yourself. And then death threats, well, now that's just illegal, right? Like, is it really that important? And I say this as someone who's devoting my life, and spent thousands of dollars going to a film school. Like, I've devoted my whole life to film. So I'm not saying film doesn't matter. But is this really a hill you want to die on? Sending death threats to a black actress just because it's making Star Wars woke? It just makes no sense to me. Now, full disclosure, and I buried the lead here so you wouldn't click away. I have not watched The Acolyte. Full disclosure. I am a busy man, and I've not been super enthused by Disney's Star Wars, like the Disney Plus Star Wars shows. I thought The Mandalorian Season 1 was fine. Like, I was already hating on it. Well, not hating. I already thought it was fine, if not mediocre, from Season 1. And the only thing I really liked is Andor. Just because it's so different, and it just, like, actually has, like, strong writing and direction, right? So I have not watched this, but it intrigues me, right? I'm intrigued by the textual elements, right? From reading that premise. The story seems really interesting. Like, not even just as, like, a new, fresh take on Star Wars, just in a vacuum, it just seems like this interesting kind of crime thriller idea, right? And I'm not opposed to challenging our conceptions of the Star Wars mythos, right? Star Wars is super important to me. It's it's Revenge of the Sith is the movie that made me want to make movies, of course, as I've said a million times. But I'm not opposed to reinterpreting the mythos. I might not always like it, but I'm not opposed to it in principle, right? Whereas, again, I feel like a lot of people are just opposed to it, like, just from the jump before they've even really seen, like, how it's done, right? But like a lot of things, especially when it comes to Star Wars and Disney content, ultimately it comes down to execution. A film is more than the script. A film is more than its story. A film is this kind of whole. The whole should be more than the sum of its parts. So just because it has an interesting story doesn't mean that the writing's going to be good, or the direction, or the performances, or the visual effects, or the pace. Like, there's so many other things about a story. Or a film, rather. So, again, a lot of people prop up films and shows because of what, again, the scripts textually convey. Again, like the premise or like the story arc. But a lot of those same people will have very little regard for the formal elements of cinema. So, again, something can have really interesting ideas, but mediocre writing and direction and performances and all of that. And from what I've read in some of these reviews and kind of obituaries for The Acolyte, that seems to kind of be the sentiment with this. So I have a couple here. So IGN's 6 out of 10 review said, quote, "Brimming with strong ideas for new directions in the Star Wars universe, The Acolyte's first season is hurt by clumsy storytelling," end quote. Kotaku similarly wrote in their, not review, but like one of these post-mortem article said, quote, Star Wars The Acolyte was a divisive, uneven, and daring stab at a different type of Jedi story, end quote, right? So it's daring, but it's also uneven, right? There's this kind of tension between the potential and the execution. And going even further, Eric Kane at Forbes wrote, quote, "The show itself was not a hit largely because it was poorly written, riddled with plot holes, had very uneven acting from its various leads, and looked cheap despite its enormous cost," end quote. And I think that's a really salient point, is that, you know, a lot of people are gonna point to this as, oh, the show was canceled because Disney gave in to the trolls. And that's partially true in an indirect way, which I'll talk about, but I want to put a pin in that. But just briefly, the real answer is just because it wasn't as successful as they wanted it to be. Now we can then discuss why it wasn't as successful. But I think Eric Kane at Forbes kind of puts it best, is that ultimately it's just not a stellar piece of television. And for the cost, to Disney, it just wasn't worth it. So again, why did Disney do this? Again, it reinforces that Disney... It's Disney catering to the worst parts of the Star Wars fandom, right? During this past decade of Star Wars content, even though The Force Awakens came out 9 years ago, again, we got that trailer in like the end of 2014, right? You know, over these 10 years, Disney and Lucasfilm have ranged from, at worst, catering and kind of giving in to the demands of like, you know, these, you know, kind of, for lack of a better word, bigoted trolls, at worst, but then also even just at best, not really defending those stars, right? Not really putting in the work to enable these new diverse cast members to be successful within the fandom. And ultimately, it's because they're a corporation. Corporations aren't your friend, and they don't really give a shit about any of this stuff anyway. Because again, even if Disney supports diversity, or they say they do, this decision, even though no official reason was given, this sends a signal to those trolls, intentional or not, that like this is because like good. This is because we spoke up and defended Star Wars from the woke mob, right? And again, it sends a signal that, you know, ultimately they're a corporation first. Social justice issues are tools in a corporation's toolkit. That is always secondary to the concerns of capitalism. So you see, after, you know, George Floyd's murder and, you know, very, very necessary social unrest and a social movement, speaking to the anger and the decades of systemic issues we have in this country, you have all these corporations posting black squares, talking about Black Lives, blah, 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 blah. The only reason why they were doing that, and it's called woke capitalism, is because they they felt that it would be good for business to do that. But when push comes to shove, they will always put the needs of capital first, right? And again, that speaks to the real reason why this happened, is ultimately this show just fell below their expectations. There's an estimated $180 million budget for this 8-episode season, which again would be a really big budget for a movie, let alone a TV show. And they wanted to see higher viewership. They wanted to see more viewers per dollar spent on this, and they weren't getting that. So, you know, to them, it wasn't worth it. So reactions to the cancellation obviously are as polarizing as the initial reception to the show was. So fans of the show were immensely disappointed. The hashtag renew the Acolyte began trending. I have a couple Twitter quotes here from people who are expressing their disappointment at this happening. At SW, as in Star Wars, at SW_holocron on Twitter said, quote, "Shocking and devastating Star Wars news today. The Acolyte has been canceled after one season. So many plot threads left unanswered. Darth Plagueis, the tie between Vernestra Rwoh and Khmer, Osha's turn to the dark side. So many more stories to tell. Hashtag renewed the Acolyte." At Richard Church 16 on Twitter said, quote, "Really sucks to hear the news of the Acolyte's cancellation. The show had a lot of promise, especially in its back half, and I was excited and intrigued to see where it would go next. Hopefully its story and characters can continue in some other form, but what a bummer," end quote. One more quote here from Twitter. At Kalen Real Life says, quote, "The Acolyte has been canceled and I am baffled. I know a lot of weird people on the internet made it their whole personality to hate it, but it was genuinely some of my favorite Star Wars, period. Many people I know enjoyed it. Sad day," end quote. And again, that kind of speaks to the vibes of this, that, you know, there is like a reactionary outrage industrial complex that we've seen on YouTube, where people make like a whole living like just complaining about woke things. And like, so a good example of this is like Brie Larson as Captain Marvel. Like that movie came out 5 years ago, and you're still seeing people using like a confused look on her or dumb look on her face as like the thumbnail, being like she was proven wrong. Like all like it's like people like make it their whole personality to hate this stuff. It's like you can hate this stuff if it sucks. Like I don't really like Captain Marvel all that much, but not because it's woke. It's just because it's kind of a mediocre movie. So yeah, on the flip side, haters of the show rejoiced. I don't have any specific quotes from them, but they kind of all represent a similar sentiment that we've seen a lot recently. The quote unquote go woke, go broke. This idea that, if you indulge in social justice, you're gonna face the consequences as a company. But a lot of people point to the show's cancellation as just another sign of the current state of television, right? Again, streaming, the nature of streaming as the business model of it demands immediate success. And a byproduct of that is shows just don't have the opportunity to grow the way traditional broadcast television did, right? And if you just look within Star Wars, something like the Clone Wars had a really rocky start. And has now become beloved and is considered a cornerstone of what Star Wars is for a lot of people. Had that been made now, with a corporate kind of mind for it, because of course the Clone Wars, George Lucas is running everything, and he doesn't care about how successful it is at the jump. He's in it for the long haul. If that show was made today, that wouldn't have lasted after. For starters, it wouldn't have been 20 episode season. It would have been like 8 episodes, and it wouldn't have got renewed. So it does kind of speak to a larger issue with streaming. And one big reaction was from a writer, C.T. Jones, who is herself a black woman, works at Rolling Stone. And she wrote a big article that's gone semi-viral called, quote, "Can the best of Star Wars survive the worst of its fans?" End quote. And I've kind of cherry-picked a bunch of quotes to try to create a kind of almost like paragraph summation of the whole article. You should definitely go read the whole thing. But I'm just going to kind of read this amalgamized version here. That I developed here. She in her article says, quote, "What is crystal clear is that before Star Wars can have another successful show, the loudest voices online need to realize the Star Wars they want to return to never existed in the first place. The low audience scores, angry YouTube rants, and long Reddit threads can really boil down to one question: who determines what's real Star Wars? Extreme fans are creating a space where even the truest of Star Wars fans still wouldn't want to participate. If you thought you could make the next great Star Wars iteration, but you knew that your project could be lambasted simply for casting a person of color, is that where you would invest your time? The Star Wars fans clamoring for a return to the originals aren't just talking nonsense, they're ruining their chances to see the franchise they love grow in any meaningful way. The fans who are loudest at the moment aren't just willfully ignoring Lucas's original vision, they're making their own world smaller in the process," end quote. And I think that's really salient on her part. This idea that ultimately the fans who are most vocal in their hate are really shooting themselves in the foot long term. Because ultimately it's going to make Star Wars very, very narrow. That Disney is either not going to want to experiment, or they're not going to be able to find any filmmakers or writers that want to experiment. So Star Wars is always going to be in this weird stasis that they can't grow. And notably, most of the people doing this, again, like I said, are younger men. Like my young, maybe in their 20s or 30s. That's the generation that grew up with the prequels, dude. So like Star Wars literally changed like in your lifetime. So there's no issue with Star Wars changing. This idea of protecting Star Wars is really just a thinly veiled excuse for your bigotry. Sorry, I know that maybe this is going to piss people off. I know I'm a film news YouTuber, and a lot of the audience are probably going to be the same demographic that are causing these issues, but I just have to, I have to make this clear unequivocally. So will this show come back? Probably not. The only way it's going to come back is if people become nostalgic for it, so Disney can milk the nostalgia. Otherwise, if you really like this show, I'm sorry to report, it's over. But maybe I'll watch it, because maybe it sounds kind of neat. But maybe I won't, because it's not going to go anywhere. And it's going to have all this setup that's never going to have any payoff. So, I don't know. Okay, let me grab a quick drink here. Okay. Let's talk about story number 2. So the Megalopolis trailer, the film, the trailer for Francis Ford Coppola's newest big bold passion project, the trailer's been pulled by distributor Lionsgate over using fake critic quotes. I have a quote here from a spokesperson from Lionsgate saying, quote, "Lionsgate is immediately recalling our trailer for Megalopolis. We offer our sincere apologies to the critics involved and to Francis Ford Coppola and American Zoetrope," which is Coppola's production company, "for this inexcusable error in our vetting process. We screwed up. We are sorry," end quote. By the time it was pulled down, it had already amassed like 1.3 million views. So, the damage had already been semi-done. And Deadline notes that, reports rather, that the film's team have cut ties with the marketing consultant, Eddie Egan. So what's the context for all this? So Megalopolis, like I said, latest film, Francis Ford Coppola. It's a passion project that has been in the works since like the 1980s. And here's the Letterboxd blurb, just to give you kind of a sense of what the movie's all about. On Letterboxd, it reads, quote, "Genius artist Caesar Catalina, played by Adam Driver, I think, seeks to leap the city of New Rome into a utopian, idealistic future, while his opposition, Mayor Franklin Cicero, remains committed to a regressive status quo, perpetuating greed, special interests, and partisan warfare. Torn between them is a socialite Julia Cicero, the mayor's daughter, whose love for Caesar has divided her loyalties, forcing her to discover what she truly believes humanity deserves," end quote. So really interesting idea. It's obviously Coppola really wrestling with some big, kind of socio-political concepts here. The critical reception has not been great, right? So it had some early critic screenings, and then eventually, I think it was May, it screened in competition at Cannes, the Cannes Film Festival in France. The current critic Rotten Tomatoes score is at 53%. So not very good, right? Kind of polarizing. 3.0, on Letterboxd has a 3.0 out of 5. And if you look at, usually on Letterboxd, you usually see kind of like a bell curve of the ratings. Megalopolis is, if you go look, it's like almost like flat. Like it's like almost has an equal distribution of every possible score. That's very polarizing. And again, it's polarized critics. So while you have that, you have some really positive reviews, like from IGN's 9 out of 10 review from Siddhant, I'm going to butcher this, Siddhant Adlaka, saying, quote, "Megalopolis is, for better or for worse, a profoundly personal vision whose wordy metaphors eventually give way to jaw-dropping transformations," end quote. So you have this weird critical divide. And that's a problem when 3 or 4 months before your movie's even releasing in theaters for general audiences, it already has a pretty bad critical reception. So then they released this trailer this past Wednesday, and the trailer featured quotes, right, from critics lambasting Coppola's other classic films like The Godfather and Apocalypse Now. So the kind of messaging of the trailer is this suggestion that critics aren't all knowing and all powerful, that critics don't always know what's going to stand the test of time and become a classic. And the narration itself from Lawrence Fishburne, who I think is in the movie, the narration says in the beginning, quote, "True genius is often misunderstood," end quote, right? So this idea that, like, they're really leaning into the idea of, like, Coppola himself as a brand, we're going to kind of be tongue-in-cheek and pull all these quotes from people criticizing these films are considered some of the best, if not the best of all time, right? That's a really interesting marketing strategy. Like, kind of lean into the fact that it hasn't been getting good reviews and use it as a strength. But the issue is, it turns out that all of these quotes that were featured in this trailer can't be found in any of the reviews by the listed critics, right? So in the trailer, it references Roger Ebert, supposedly in his review for Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula film from the 90s. It claims Roger Ebert said about that film, quote, "A triumph over style over substance," end quote. This is actually the most accurate quote, because Ebert did say this, but not about Bram Stoker's Dracula. He said it about Batman 89. So that's the only one that is actually a quote from an actual review, even if it's misattributed to the wrong movie. But then you have something like Pauline Kael, which, you can, you should be able to see here up at the top, right above my head. In the trailer, it says that she said about The Godfather that it was, quote, "diminished by its artsiness," end quote. Not only is that Not only are those not words she ever wrote in a review, supposedly, IndieWire notes that she was one of The Godfather's biggest champions, right? As well as for its sequel. So not only is this not true, like, it actually kind of misrepresents how she actually feels about the movie. So obviously the reactions to this are everyone's dunking on Lionsgate in this trailer, right? So Owen Gleiberman is one of the critics cited. He's a Variety critic now, but I think in the 90s he wrote the review for Bram Stoker's Dracula for Entertainment Weekly. It incorrectly cites his 1992 review. He supposedly called the film a beautiful mess, which he did not say in his review. And he commented on this recently saying, quote, "Even if you're one of those people who don't like critics, we hardly deserve to have words put in our mouths. Then again, the trivial scandal of all of this is that the whole Megalopolis trailer is built on a false narrative. Critics loved The Godfather, and though Apocalypse Now was divisive, it received a lot of crucial critical support," end quote. So again, he's kind of pointing out that while it's an interesting marketing strategy, it's kind of ahistorical, because it would imply that these movies were kind of panned the way Megalopolis has been panned, and then later were reappraised. You may have had a couple voices here and there not liking any of these films, but they were overwhelmingly positive. It's not just a retrospective acclaim. So this is just a really interesting story because it speaks to the use of critic quotes in trailers. Usually people are getting in trouble for putting fake positive quotes. But in any case, critic quotes in trailers have always been used in a misleading way. They're often either out of context, or they're from less than reputable critics who literally exist just to make quotes that will end up in trailers, or both, right? And this isn't the first time something like this has happened. Variety notes that back in 2000, Sony released a bunch of trailers with positive critic quotes from a critic named David Manning. It turned out Manning didn't even exist. He was made up by Sony's marketing team, and Sony even ended up having to refund $5 to anyone who was convinced to see one of these movies based on the false advertising, right? So, but even when it's real, again, it's usually cherry-picked. Variety's article about this story even had a whole paragraph being like, "We at Variety try really hard to make it so that our reviews can't be taken," like little sentences in our reviews can't be taken out of context. But oftentimes, again, you have people who intentionally are writing glowing reviews just to kind of boost their own profile, so that they will get used in trailers. I think within the critic community, they're called critic whores, right? But ultimately, it's like, who thought this was a good idea? Like, obviously, like, it's great in theory. Like I said, it's an interesting marketing strategy, but you need the actual quotes from real reviews to back it up, right? And what's really interesting, I think the reason why this happens is just out of laziness, because the Hollywood Reporter notes that some of these reviewers did say things that, if taken out of context, could have served a similar purpose. It wasn't that people were saying awful things, but there was real pull quotes you could have used that could have served a similar function. So many people speculated from the jump that these quotes were generated by AI. They probably just typed in, what were some negative reviews or pull quotes from these Coppola films, right? And Variety later reported that this was indeed the case. From their article, they said, quote, "Sources tell Variety it was not Lionsgate or Egan's intention to fabricate quotes, but was an error in properly vetting and fact-checking the phrases provided by the consultant. It appears that AI was used to generate the false quotes from the critics," end quote. So, again, it just goes to show that people are just lazy. How much money did this Eddie Egan fellow get paid to do this? Like, me and my fiancée Viviana, we have our own small business of, like, a marketing agency. We could have done 10 times better doing this. And we have no experience doing a film like, marketing for a film like this, right? So, it just again, speaks to the laziness of Hollywood, of business, and it's kind of funny if it wasn't so deceptive. So I'm just glad they got caught, right? The film, is still set to release September 27th, so about a month from now. And ultimately, it'll probably still be a critical commercial dud. I don't think this is going to do financially very well, and I don't see how you can go from having a 53% on Rotten Tomatoes to having a 94, right? So I'm still excited to see it because I love Coppola's work, and it seems like it's polarizing enough that, maybe I'll like it, right? So I don't know. I'm interested to see, what ends up happening with this film, but only time will tell. Okay, let me just grab a quick drink here. Okay, let's talk about story number 3 here. So, I'm about to say a statement that I never thought I would ever say in my life. Chick-Fil-A plans to launch a streaming service. Deadline is exclusively reporting this. They're going to launch its own streaming platform for some reason. It's quote unquote aggressively moving into the entertainment space. And the fast food company, the infamous, if you will, polarizing, if you will, fast food company has been working with a number of major production companies, and is seeking to create family-friendly content, particularly in the unscripted space, budgeting about roughly $400,000 per half hour, but also dipping its toes into scripted and animated content, right? On top of developing its own content, it's in talks to license and acquire content as well. And it's planning on launching sometime later this year. So this is not a far off kind of, maybe we're kind of thinking of this. Like, this is moving ahead very quickly in the immediate future. Deadline notes that Chick-fil-A, the company joins a group of a small but notable group of non-entertainment companies moving into this space. So Lyft, the ride-sharing app platform, has produced shows like Lucky Lift with Bob the Drag Queen, right? And then Airbnb, for some reason, produced the documentary Gay Chorus Deep South for MTV. So this is not unheard of, but this is like a whole other level. And even Chick-fil-A itself has slowly been moving into content creation. So for people who have been paying attention, this is not super crazy, because they've already produced the animated web series that was on their website called Stories of Evergreen Hills, which this is a picture from. The description of the show from the website is a series of animated short films, collectibles, and experiences created by Chick-fil-A. Stories of Evergreen Hills follows a young girl named Sam as she discovers how little acts of kindness can bring people together, end quote. In a past life, I used to do DoorDash driving in the suburbs of Rhode Island. And Chick-fil-A was always a popular spot. And recently, the most recent time I was door dashing, I remember seeing these characters be like, who the hell are these people? Who are these children in this Chick-fil-A? So you have that kind of already as a animated web series, and they've also developed children's puzzles and like board games and stuff. So this is not completely out of left field, but it's still coming out of left field. It's still strange that a fast food company is developing its own streaming platform. Not even just developing content. And, again, it's not completely unheard of. The Daily Beast notes that McDonald's, back in the day, produced the show McDonaldland. And, they've had a lot of entertainment content, over the years. And that made more sense because there was a cast of characters that surrounded the brand. So you had Ronald McDonald, you had the Hamburglar, you had Grimace, you had the weird duck girl. I was never into it feels like it was a very 70s, 80s, maybe 90s thing. That's kind of before my time. But does Chick-fil-A plan to build a similar roster of cartoon characters? I'm not sure. We really don't have a lot of details. Another thing that's really up in the air that I think a lot of people, at least I asked the minute I saw this article, is the content of this platform going to reflect the company's political stance, right? This Stories of Evergreen Hill doesn't seem to be overtly Christian or culture war-y, but and I say this as a Christian, this idea of like the small acts of kindness, it's fitting in with like that kind of publicly palatable kind of sense of Christian values, right? But is their content going to be a little more explicit, right? So, of course, the company's infamous for donating to anti-LGBTQ organizations. Some of those organizations even went as far as supporting things like conversion therapy, which, if you don't know, is a medically debunked pseudoscience, this idea that you could somehow make gay people straight using, different chemical processes and psychological processes and conditionings. So they weren't just supporting kind of like vaguely conservative organizations. Like, they were supporting companies and nonprofits that were actively supporting conversion therapy, which is, kind of a big no-no. And that's why a lot of people won't even entertain the idea of even just getting food from Chick-Fil-A, right? Which I can understand. And could this platform become a little niche for family-friendly conservative content? So not like something like the Daily Wire, which makes very on-the-nose culture war content. Could this become kind of a niche for the dog whistle for traditional family values, right? Again, even if it's just like inoffensive Christian dramas, is that kind of where they're leaning? I'm not sure, right? So again, like we said, it seems like they want to do a lot of unscripted stuff. It seems like the big program that is really kind of far along is like a game show, but we really don't know like what's the nature of the game show. So it's gonna be interesting to see like what kind of content does the Chick-fil-A streaming platform. It such sounds weird coming out of my mouth. What kind of content the Chick-fil-A streaming platform is gonna produce? But this is interesting because haven't we learned that streaming platforms are not financially lucrative unless you have a huge library? Again, a company like this producing content, sure, that kind of makes some sense. But do they really need their own platform? It seems like it just doesn't really make sense unless you subscribe to what The Verge notes in their article about this. This might be motivated by data, right? So something that's been really valuable in the digital age with YouTube and just like online searching and stuff in general is, of course, we're all being tracked in all of our cookies and all of our data and all this stuff, whatever all the terms are. So advertisers are able to advertise to people with a precision never before seen in the history of advertising, right? And that's valuable across the internet. But then if you're a company like, let's say, Disney, which is very diversified, because you don't just make the television content, but you also have merchandise, you also have the theme parks. Disney, it's 100% or 99% confirmed, right? They'd be stupid not to do this. They are looking at the Disney Plus streaming data, and that is informing some of their decisions on what stuff to make, what attractions to build at the theme parks, what kind of merchandise do we really want to push. Right? So that could be valuable data. So again, viewing habits can reveal directly or indirectly consumer interests. And again, these insights can inform business decisions. So if this is the goal, Chick-fil-A is maybe trying to use this. See, that's the thing though, is unlike with Disney, it's all entertainment. How do they use this viewing data? How do they leverage that into selling chicken sandwiches? I just don't understand. If this is the goal, I think ultimately it should just be free and with ads, because I feel like it's going to be hard pressed unless it's like a really low price, like a couple bucks a month. I don't see anyone spending $10 a month on the Chick-fil-A streaming service. So ultimately this is just very surreal, again, that I'm even saying this. But the bright side is that if nothing else, it'll be good to have another production source, right? That's the issue with Hollywood, is that there's only so many pockets, right? There's a lot of money, but there's only so many people who are able to give out or use the money. So, it's always an issue when a production company closes or gets absorbed, or even worse, a big distributor, like we saw like with Disney acquiring 20th Century Fox. That's one less player. That's one less potential distributor to produce and distribute content. A certain, if you're a filmmaker, right? You want more potential buyers. So if nothing else, this allows for more content to be made. It allows for more people to be employed. So if nothing else, that is definitely a nice byproduct. Certainly not the main objective here for Chick-fil-A. Okay, let me grab a quick drink here. Okay, let's talk about story number 4. So, Rotten Tomatoes has unveiled a new dimension to its popcorn meter called Verified Hot. So we have a quote here from Amanda Norvell, who's the Senior Vice President of Direct-to-Consumer Services at the company, saying, quote, "On Rotten Tomatoes, fans love to consult our verified audience score in addition to the Tomato Meter critic score when discovering new movies and deciding what they want to watch next. With the addition of Verified Hot, we are excited to celebrate and shine a spotlight on the theatrical films that fans have unanimously embraced and have taken the time to share their incredible movie-going experience with other fans," end quote. So a little bit of a primer on how Rotten Tomatoes works. So it's a review aggregator, right? And when you go to a movie's Rotten Tomatoes page and it says 83%, the score reflects what percent of reviewers gave a film a positive review. Rotten Tomatoes defines a positive review as like a 6 out of 10 or 60% or whatever it is or better, right? So again, if everyone is not an average of the scores, that 83%. If everyone gives a movie a 6 out of 10, it would have a 100% rating, right? It's more of a statistical probability of will you have a net positive experience. Now, that doesn't mean that really does nothing to answer will you have an overwhelmingly net positive experience or just a net positive experience. Maybe that's how it works. So it originally started as just critics, right? And there was this idea of fresh versus rotten, right? So if it had a 60% or more, it was considered fresh. If it had 59% or less, it was rotten. And then they eventually introduced verified fresh. So this would be a tomato meter, is what they call it. A tomato meter score of 75% or higher with at least 5 reviews from what Rotten Tomatoes has designated as top critics. So these are critics who are working for major publications, who have been in the game for a really long time, as opposed to, an upstart blogger who is legit enough to even be included on Rotten Tomatoes, right? Because I write film reviews, but I don't get to be included. So it adds a level of like, okay, a movie can be fresh, but then there's an extra badge of honor if it's verified fresh, right? And similarly, they also have an audience score where fans can give it a rating, similar deal. If it's a 6 out of 10 or better, that counts as positive, and then if it's 60% or more, instead of being fresh or rotten, because it's a popcorn meter, it's either hot or stale. The issue with audience scores is that they can be easily manipulated, right? So, at least the critics have to be like actual people that have like a reputation that they want to presumably preserve. Anyone could just make an account and review a movie even if they haven't seen it, right? And this, of course, leads to review bombing, where the intentional, effort to leave bad scores on movies, particularly when you don't like it because you consider it quote unquote woke, right? So now they're introducing, similar to Verified Fresh, they're introducing Verified Hot. And this will be a badge that a movie will be awarded based on those who actually saw the movie. So Rotten Tomatoes' parent company is Fandango, like the movie ticket servicing company. So the idea is going to be that if enough people who Fandango and Rotten Tomatoes can verify actually bought a ticket and saw this movie, if enough of those people give it a hot rating, right, a fresh, a positive rating, if enough people do that, it'll get that Verified Hot badge, right? They do eventually plan to collaborate with other ticket vendors to expand this functionality. So like if for me, I get a lot of my tickets directly through like AMC or Regal. Like I have the apps. I don't use Fandango for that. So the plan is to eventually expand that. Again, this is all is all in an effort to prevent or at least mitigate review bombing. And like we talked about earlier this evening, the Acolyte, the Star Wars show, the Acolyte is one of the most recent examples of something where that has a 78% critic score and an 18% audience score. One could argue that critics are just out of touch, but that seems like that's a much larger issue. Ultimately, people shouldn't put too much stock in these scores, right? I think people try to look at it almost like sports, and which is very numbers based. And they try to go, like, if you're a fan of one franchise and you're pitting yourself against another franchise. Well, our film had a higher Rotten Tomatoes score than your film, blah, 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 and it becomes this weird thing. Again, something like Rotten Tomatoes especially is really good for a statistical probability. That if I see a movie has an 83%, that means there's an 83% chance I'm going to have a net positive experience with this film. But these scores shouldn't define a film. And The Independent notes a tweet from an unknown user. I don't know why a mainstream publication like The Independent wouldn't give the source of the tweet, like who said this. But this is a really interesting tweet, so I was like, I had to include this. And the tweet was, quote, "The worst thing Rotten Tomatoes has done is gradually elevating the importance of audience scores alongside critic scores. That's not what the site was ever supposed to be," end quote. Because when you go on Rotten Tomatoes, you see both scores right next to each other, which gives which signals this idea that audiences and critics are kind of this co-equal critical entity, which is just not the case. Most people don't have good taste in movies, right? And it's not their fault. They just don't have the training necessarily, right? Or even just the exposure to enough movies. So, and again, because they don't really have a reputation that they need to preserve, they can be very motivated by very self-interested personal motivations, right? So this is an interesting addition to Rotten Tomatoes. It'll be interesting. What will be interesting to see is if it actually solves or at least fixes somewhat of the review bombing problem. Okay, this is a first for Cinema and QSO. I've actually run out of water. So I'm going to run to the kitchen, fill up my cup, and come right back. So don't go anywhere. I'm going to be right back. Did everyone leave? No, okay. Everyone's still here. Great. Okay, let's talk about story number 5. Let me just grab one more quick drink. All right, let's talk about story number 5. Just when you thought the Paramount saga was over, it gets a whole new wrinkle. So, Edgar Bronfman Jr. Has finally, because originally he had signaled that he was considering an offer, and I think I had talked about it in a previous story. Edgar Bronfman Jr. has finally made an offer for Paramount Global. This offer was initially valued at $4.3 billion, and then, like literally just a day or two after the offer was made, he sweetened the deal to $6 billion. So he added about $1.7 billion. So it's not just him; he's the primary, actor in this offer, but he is kind of leading a bidding group. Which also includes a strange hodgepodge of people. So it also includes Stephen Paul, who's a filmmaker who created the film Baby Geniuses. Also includes John Martin, who is the former CFO of Time Warner. Includes Brock Pierce, who's a former child actor and is now a big player in the crypto space. This also includes Nurali Aliyev, who is a Kazakh businessman and the grandson of the former president of Kazakhstan. And also includes John Miller, who's a partner at Ding Ding Ding, Sherry Redstone, who's the owner of National Amusements, which owns Paramount. John Miller is a partner at Sherry Redstone's Advanced Capital investment firm. So what are the details of this offer? So it would include a $2.4 billion payout to Sherry Redstone. It would include a $1.5 billion amount to pay down some of the debt. It would include the $400 million breakup fee with Skydance, right? And that additional $1.7 billion that he added later on could be offered to Class B shareholders for $16 a share. So notably, that's higher than the $15 per share that Skydance was offering for Class B shareholders. But it would not take out other Paramount shareholders, right? So the Skydance deal apportioned $4.5 billion to buy out all of the Class A shareholders and a chunk of Class B shareholders. Notably, this would not involve a complicated two-step acquisition the way Skydance would. The idea they would just acquire National Amusements from Sherry Redstone and then indirectly now control Paramount. And Bronfman, in a letter to Charles Phillips, who heads Paramount's merger and acquisition committee, in his letter to Phillips, Bronfman said, quote, "Our proposal eliminates the risks, uncertainties, and costs of combining Paramount with Skydance. We believe Paramount is most valuable as a standalone business," end quote. So again, I'm not going to belabor this. The context for all of this, Paramount has been up for sale for like almost a year now. And Skydance Media, run by David Ellison, son of, tech mogul Larry Ellison, Skydance seemed like the most likely eventual buyer, or suitor, if you will, right? It's what Redstone wanted the most, because she would get disproportionately benefit from the deal, which made a lot of shareholders unhappy, again, with that disproportionate payout that she would get. And multiple suitors have come and gone. There was Sony at one time, Byron Allen, the list goes on and on. Paramount and Skydance ultimately, and what I thought was finally the freaking end of the story, Paramount and Skydance finally settled on a deal in July, which part of the deal included a provision. It allowed Paramount a 45-day, quote-unquote, go shop period to allow for new potential bids, right? The idea being is that it would kind of shield Sherry Redstone from any legal retribution from unhappy shareholders, saying like, look, we opened the floor to other better offers and nothing came along. And God forbid, but it seems like God is forbidding. God forbid Paramount reneged on the Skydance deal and went with a different deal. The provision stipulated that Paramount would then owe Skydance a $400 million breakup fee. So again, they had this 45-day go shop period, and this new offer came in literally like right before the deadline. I think the deadline was like last week. So who is Edgar Bronfman Jr.? So he's a former CEO. He's the former CEO of Warner Music Group. He's currently the executive chairman of Fubo TV, the sports streaming service. He's heir to the Seagram fortune, which is like a Canadian beverages company. I think it started out in whiskey, but I think it's moved on to so many different kinds of tasty beverages. Notably, he's friendly with the Redstone family. Again, I feel like a lot of rich people kind of just run in the same circles. And the New York Times note, because also they're both heirs, right? Sherry Redstone did not build the Paramount empire. Her father, Sumner Redstone, did. Similarly, Bronfman is the heir to a big fortune, so they kind of have that. And in all ways, David Ellison is too. This is a story of rich billionaire kids, essentially, all arguing over who gets the toy. And the New York Times notes that if his bid were to be successful, Bronfman is seeking to run the company as the CEO. And upon this offer, Paramount, because they could have just said, we're not going to take this seriously. We don't think it's going to be a good deal. Paramount officially extended the go shop window. So obviously they're taking the offer seriously. Now the window is extended to September 5th. The committee the special committee for Paramount that's reviewing all these offers and deals put out a statement saying, quote, "There can be no assurance this process will result in a superior proposal. The company does not intend to disclose further developments unless and until it determines such disclosure is appropriate or is otherwise required," end quote. So ultimately they're like, put a pin in this, don't ask us about it, we gotta look at this thing. But they couldn't just go, we're not going to take this seriously. They have to evaluate this offer, right? Because, again, it's such a good deal and fairly comparable to the Skydance deal. Again, they could face legal trouble if they were to just ignore this wholesale. Because, again, it's just too good of a deal. So what does Bronfman want with Paramount? Well, why is he doing this? So, again, he would want to be the CEO, but Variety notes, rather when I say what does he want with Paramount, more so like what would he do with it? Variety notes that he may consider selling certain divisions, like CBS or like MTV and Nickelodeon, things like that. The LA Times notes that this bidding group believes it can save up to $3 billion in costs, as opposed to Skydance. They only estimated $2 billion in costs, and they would do this by boosting streaming profits, employing AI in business functions, and quote unquote right-sizing the bloated corporate structure. Right sizing just means finding the optimal size for the corporate structure here. Again, all of those things sound great, but easier said than done. And it seems like shareholders are interested in the idea, right? So we have a quote here from Alan Gould, who's a capital analyst, saying, quote, "It is cleaner and simpler in that it does not require Paramount to pay up to buy an asset from the acquirer. However, it does not give the public the same opportunity to sell half their shares at an above market price. Also, the Paramount board will have to decide which asset mix it prefers, with the Skydance offer slightly more weighted to content creation and which team it believes will be able to better run the ongoing company," end quote. Right? So there's this, it's very interesting. They're comparable in terms of the money, because I think Skydance is $8 billion, but even though it's technically more money, it's not necessarily more money because it involves this weird kind of stock thing. So it's, while being financially comparable, it really does give Paramount a fork in the road. Two different visions of how they want this company to go, right? So can Skydance prevail? Could they fended off Sony, right, of all people. They fended off a bunch of other suitors. It seemed like the deal was going to fall through, and then it ended up at the last second going through. And the Hollywood Reporter notes that, David Ellison being loaded and his father being loaded, Skydance has deep pockets to fight a bidding war. And again, while it's more complicated, the Skydance deal does have the value of actually providing a new creative direction for the company, whereas the Bronfman deal would essentially leave the company's current structure mostly intact. It would just have someone else owns National Amusements. Whereas the Skydance deal, it would merge Paramount and Skydance. You would have David Ellison, who himself is a creative producer in the industry. It really would be a new, for better or for worse, a new creative direction. The Bronfman deal would more or less be more of the same, short of the cost-cutting measures. Skydance is not happy about this. So lawyers from Skydance sent a letter to the special committee saying, quote, "Paramount has committed an incurable material breach of the transaction agreement. While Skydance is not currently exercising its right to terminate the transaction agreement, we reserve the right to do so in the future," end quote. Yahoo Finance notes that this basically comes down to a technicality. Supposedly, Paramount did not notify Skydance in writing of the extension in the appropriate amount of time. Because again, the original agreement did allow for them to extend the negotiating window if a certain offer came around. But Skydance is basically trying to say, well, technically you didn't do it in time, so you can't explore this idea. Clearly, this is just Skydance lawyers trying to come up with a way to stall this, because this scares them shitless, as it should. But this thing in their letter saying, "Oh, like we're not going to exercise our right to terminate the agreement, but we have the right to do so." That's very much like you're really, that's a bluff. That's a bluff. On paper, Paramount needs this more, but Skydance wants it more, right? So for better or for worse, Paramount could be dumb and not maintain this relationship. Even though it really needs it more than Skydance does. But David Ellison really wants to be the CEO of Paramount, of a merged Paramount Skydance. So in this letter claims the Bronfman deal is, quote, "significantly less favorable to the Paramount stockholders from a financial point of view," end quote. Which is semi-true, because in the Bronfman deal, the Class A shareholders wouldn't be bought out at all. But again, on the flip side, the Class B shareholders would have a higher premium on their shares. So, I think right now, Skydance is throwing shit at the wall, seeing what sticks. Ultimately, this is one of the most chaotic M&A stories in Hollywood history. Again, it's been back and forth for months. Again, it finally got a deal. It seemed like everything was settled, and it all got thrown into turmoil again. And I have a quote here from Charles Elson, who's the founding director of the Weinberg Center for Corporate Governance at the University of Delaware. Say that 5 times fast. This guy is saying, quote, "This has been a very strange process. This company has provided more theater than any other company I can think of. It's just remarkable that we are here. It's just remarkable that here we are," end quote. Ultimately, Sherry Redstone has the final say, right? And this deal's interesting because it seems like she'll get the same payout no matter what, that $2.4 billion. Again, the big thing with Skydance versus something like Sony was always that the Skydance deal would keep the empire that her father built intact, whereas someone like Sony would kind of sell it for parts. Seems like Bronfman wouldn't be as aggressive as Sony would, but would at least be willing to sell those parts, right? And I think that gives Sherry Redstone pause, but again, does she want to face the shareholder revolt? And And right now she's kind of in a damned if she does, damned if she doesn't, because even if they don't go through with the deal, if they really explore this, it could damage the relationship with Skydance, right? Even if they end up merging, right? And I have a quote here from Melissa A. Schilling, who's a management professor at NYU's Stern School of Business, saying, quote, "Is creating conflict with Skydance, and should they prevail, they're going to come in angry. That's not a great way to start a marriage," end quote. So, this could end up being not good for Paramount, even if nothing changes from this deal and the Skydance thing just goes ahead as planned. Okay, let me just grab a quick drink here before we kind of wrap up. Okay, so looking ahead to the upcoming films this weekend, we have Afraid, but it's spelled like the word afraid, it's spelled the same way, but the AI in Afraid is capitalized. Obviously, it's a horror film about AI. Kind of feels like in the vein of something like Megan. Not expected to open very big. I'm only projecting about 5 to 10 million. Again, it's just another. Technically, it would be this Friday is still August, right? August 30th. Yeah. So this is again another example of like an August film. Might be good, might be fine, but is not gonna really do that spectacularly at the box office. Okay, so that wraps up the show. Just want to give a few quick plugs. This isn't my only YouTube channel. I have a sister channel called Peter Squared, where I cover topics related to film, media, and entertainment in a video essay format. The video I have up right now is called A Closer Look at Frozen, where, you guess it, I take a closer look at Frozen, the Disney film, taking a look at what went right, what went wrong, and everything in between, using these, old and young cartoon versions of myself. Really would be a huge help if you go check out that video, like the video, go subscribe to that channel. You can find the link in the description down below. Also want to give a shout out to the podcast I do with my fiance Viviana called Now That's What I Call a Franchise, where we pick a film franchise and we go through every single installment, the good, the bad, and the ugly. This season we're doing Star Wars, which is really exciting. Our most recent episode that released last Friday was on, the Ewok Adventure, right? The Caravan of Courage, depending on your region. So that was a lot of fun. Our upcoming episode is the other Ewoks TV movie. A lot of fun talking about those really silly yet surprisingly cute movies. So it really would be a huge help if you go check that out. You can listen wherever you get your podcasts. You can also listen on YouTube if that's your preferred way to listen to podcasts. You can also just find us at the link in the description down below. And then finally, I want to plug Cinema and QSO. It's not just a YouTube channel. It started as and still is a Substack newsletter where I write more written reviews for new films coming out. Really would be a huge help if you go check that out. I have a big backlog of over 100 reviews at this point. I think you might get a kick out of them. So definitely go check that out. Support what I'm trying to do here. Really would be a huge help. You can find the link in the description below. You can also just go to your browser, type in cinemanqso.substack.com. That's it for this week. Thank you all so much for watching. Again, if you haven't already, please like this live stream. Really helps people find the channel. If you haven't, please subscribe. We're trying to grow the community. Hopefully we can keep growing it. Until next week, I'm Peter Mancuso. Peace out.